but actually in that Arctic city of Archangel, a city which traded in flax and timber with Dundee. The outbreak of the revolution, followed by the horror of the Civil War, the collapse of Archangel to the invading Red forces, intensified by repression and starvation, forced my parents to decide that if we were to survive, we had to reach Scotland. For had it not been for my Scots mother, my young brother and I would have probably perished, as perished so many of my friends and relatives. Yet, I would like to add that recently, to my great astonishment, I have received an invitation to visit Archangel with my husband and son for the duration of 4 weeks, with all expenses paid for while in Russia. This, my friends, after a lapse of 70 long years. I entered the house. It embraced me, holding me fast for the next 8 years until the morning of my childhood was over. Quietly flowed our provincial life these days in this backwater. No one at all appeared to be aware of the distant rumble of the approaching storm. If they were, they never said so.
Приветствуем вас на земле нашей северной. Просим отведать хлеба с солью. Вот кушайте. Откушайте, пожалуйста. Хлеб с солью откушайте.
Ну вот, дорогие друзья, помог. Мне как-то не верит, что я стою сейчас на родной земле. Всей душой благодарю вас всех за ваше приглашение приехать на границу после многих лет отсутствия. Очень. A group of American ladies traveling around the north of Russia presented the local library of Archangel with my book. And it seemed to have taken off in a big way, because 3 months ago this letter arrives in which the head of the foreign books department of the library tells me that you have no idea how many people have read your book, how much they love you, and how much they would like to meet you. And we would be so happy if you could only come and visit us.
You're right.
Сеньора, о, милый мой, да, вот. Единственный мой родственник здесь. Мне нужно поцеловать. Так мама так любила вашего папу.
I'm just happy to see you all, our dear friends from Scotland. The country is so far from our Archangels. Well, we do feel we have something in common with you, and we do appreciate your feelings you expressed in your book. And well, it's just a happiness to have you to have you here. Well, excuse my mistakes. Well, I'm very nervous. Well, and let us all drink the health of our guests and greet them in Archangelsk.
We would like to join this welcome. Heartwarming welcome.
Please.
We're very happy to be here.
Yeah.
You're doing very well, Tanya. You're doing very well.
Just look at me.
I'm very, very happy. I never believed that such a wonderful thing could happen after 70 long years. I left as a young girl of 14. I'm returning an old woman. I only have one relative here,
yes.
and that is my relative.
Here he is.
Oh, I must find my old house. I want to see it. I know where I am now. That's wonderful. What is that street called?
Now it is Gaidarna Street.
Well, that must be the street because...
Yes, it's
yes.
It's
No.
Olonitskaya Street.
Yes.
On
Well,
which side of the street your house stood?
well, here, there, exactly there, where that
Exactly
building is
there.
standing. It stood there, and the front faced the river. Very sad. I don't recognize anything. I just see the places where everything stood at one time, as near as possible to what I remember. It lacks the charm that the old town had. It had a definite charm. The golden-headed churches have all been removed, and worst of all, the pride of the place was this magnificent cathedral with its frescoes.
Once there was a cathedral there. You might remember it.
Yes, I do remember.
Later it was blown up, and now there's a theater here. The architects think the building is very interesting. It is in the constructivism style.
But I also, my cousin, who was here as a little boy at that time, he witnessed the explosion of the cathedral. And he said then also that the people were all, they knew that something terrible was happening, and they were all standing, and then they saw groups of people arriving, and they knew that something terrible was going to happen, and the men all bared their heads, the women, and they all went on their knees, and then there was this dreadful explosion, and the top part and everything came down. And this way the cathedral was destroyed. And in its place is now the school of drama. Well. Но все-таки не совсем забыла. Как не забыла и мою дорогую родину, город Архангельск. Вам, может быть, интересно будет знать, как же я появилась в Архангельске.
Я бы хотел сделать заявку на собственный перевод.
They were asking me general questions of what I might have remembered. Did I remember, for instance, various people who had lived in my time? They brought the book to ask me in which line did I come from.
She knows very much about her relatives, about her ancestry. This is very unusual for us, because we do not know anything about our ancestors. I've come to learn many facts I didn't know before. Some facts about the Tsar, I didn't know anything about it. And the interesting thing is that she treats the Tsar positively. There are some examples of it in the book. It is very surprising for me, because I didn't hear anything good of the Tsar. And in this book, he appeals to be very kind, and he has a way with people. It is very well felt that Mrs. Fraser is Russian, because she writes that something of Russia crept into her soul.
Молодецкого плеча, ах, легка, легка моя коробочка плеч, не режет ремешок. А всего взяла моя зазнобушка бирюзовый перстенек. Ах, легка, легка моя коробочка плеч, не режет ремешок. А всего взяла моя зазнобушка бирюзовый перстенек. Ай-яй-яй-яй-яй-яй, бирюзовый перстенек.
Это наша памятная медаль города и значок, который был изготовлен в честь празднования 400-летия города Архангельска. И дата основания Архангельска 1584 год.
От всей души благодарю вас.
Еще по такой же час я всем подарю.
Не ожидала этого. Очень, очень благодарю вас.
Это же для вас.
Это я себе сказала. Вот. Самое главное, потому что они могут понять, правда или нет, или как я пишу. Это самое главное, что она попала. I thought the purpose of me visiting would be them to have a little talk with me, ask this and that, but they began by telling me that they were very anxious to know the truth. When they asked me what was my feelings about it all, I would have liked to have said that I didn't approve of anything that sort of destroyed the will or the opinion of other people. But instead I said, well, I have to say I don't like communism, and perhaps I really wonder if that was the right thing to say. I should have put it perhaps in another way, but they were quite pleased. I think they're all anti-communism now. They've discovered that after 70 years it's not exactly been a success. The first revolution occurred in March of 1917. At that time, I was going on my 12th year. On my way to school, I noticed a group of men carrying flags and singing revolutionary songs. And then, as I entered the school, and we were all collected upstairs, as we usually were for our morning prayers, our headmistress announced, she said, girls, from now on there won't be any more singing of our national anthem. And as we glanced at the wall where only the day before were seen the portraits of our Russian royal family, and now were only blanks, we realized that a new era had commenced. And that was the start of the first, what was known as a democratic revolution under the ruling of Kerensky. But by October, Lenin's communists took over in Leningrad. And from that moment, and even actually before, the civil war broke out. It has been said, terrible and frightening was the war after the Second Revolution, the like of which the Russian, or in fact the world, had never seen before. There was fighting with the forces, the whites on one side and the reds on this side, you see. It was the other way about. The whites were on this side and the reds were on the other side, and they were fighting for the possession of the town. But then eventually the reds fled and went right up the river, you see, and all the boats that they could find, they fled up the river. and established, of course, their own communist government further up, you see. At least it was that was a civil war. You cannot say it was properly established because it wasn't until 1920 that they finally won the war.
What would I like to mean?
To the victims of the intervention of 1920. And the head of all the various forces that came in was General Ironside. We all imagined that the Allied intervention was there to fight the Bolsheviks, which they did, yes, they did. But the main thing was, of course, to have the Russians fighting the Germans, you see. And Lenin had already spread the gospel that there would be peace and no more fighting. But the White Guards, as they were called, they were still keen to be loyal to our allies, the French and British, and to continue the fight against the Germans. And this is what we thought, that the Allied expedition was here to fight the Bolsheviks and to see them defeated. All the ships coming in from the White Sea, from all the different countries, came into that channel and came out suddenly into view. And that is what happened during the time of the Allied intervention. And all the people were standing, we waited, and suddenly, just as this boat is standing there, the first ship came into view, and it was followed. It was a Russian ship, but it was a cruiser, and it was followed by all the ships of the Allies, the Americans, the French, they were all there, and they sailed on right past in front of our house, you know. Some of my relatives were sitting on the balcony. It was a tremendous sight because they stretched right out. And everybody, of course, was cheering from here, and they were cheering back to us. Well, of course, we had all these Americans, French, Italians, the town. I think there was more forces than there were of the civilians living in the town. And of course, my mother, being a Scot, we entertained a lot of the British Tommies. We entertained officers, we entertained soldiers, we entertained the French, and we entertained the Americans.
I don't think anybody in Arkhangelsk would tell us, frankly, that they, well, had receptions of the foreign officers in their houses. There are not many unknown facts, historical facts, in Mrs. Fraser's book for our public. But her interpretation, her point of view is just quite the opposite.
This is amazing. I remember seeing it when I was coming home from school one day, shortly after the town fell. And there it was, standing helplessly at the side of the road. All these tanks, it was not alone, all these tanks were sent from Britain, but it was discovered afterwards that they could not stand up to the frost. The petrol froze and the terrain was not suitable. And so they did not prove to be of any help, which was quite a tragedy. By the autumn of 1919, all these ships were going back. They had no reason to stay. The war was over. And as far as the Russian fighting between the Red and Whites, well, they were not concerned very much with that. So some of them departed. Already so many of them departed. And it so happened that this was, I would say, maybe 8 o'clock or so in the morning. And we saw them going away. And I always remember my uncle saying, "Why did they come at all? We shall pay for this." And we did. Mrs. Kemp was the daughter of a man who was very well known and very learned. And she herself has a remarkable memory and can tell you anything from A to Z of these distant days. She still remembers all the various people who lived in certain streets, what they did.
Я не могла понять, почему
I could not understand why I did not receive an answer from you. And it transpired that apparently you had sent all these plans and they were returned by saying, along with the letter, that no plans are allowed to leave Archangel.
Попов и Yevgheniya Ghermanovna Scholts, они...
She knew, for instance, my grandparents and even my first grandfather.
Очень умный и очень милосердный, очень много делал добра.
She's saying that my grandfather was a very clever man. Yes, and did a lot of good to the people, and he was well known, yes. My step-grandfather, who was a surgeon, was more interested in his patients than in any political movements. But I suppose we belonged to that middle class, one might call us, and so if an Archangel fell to the invading Red forces, life became very difficult for us. We suffered searches, others were arrested. Our neighbors' children, their father was a colonel in the Russian White Army. He was one of the first to be executed. And they were the children who joined our gang after, you know. We weren't interested in politics being young. We were more interested in what we could find to eat. I remember being sent across the river with a silver spoon in my hand to try and reach the villages where we used to know the people there and have the spoon perhaps to offer in exchange for milk. And I remember the peasant woman who knew the family said, "Well, there you are, Barishnya," she called me. She says, "I remember the day when I worked in the sawmills and had to run back and feed my child during the short meal hour, and him crying his head off. Things are different now. But there you are, asking me for milk. But," she says, "I like a bit of silver, and yes, I will give you some milk."
What went on longer than...
Не знаю, как иначе сказать.
I've heard all the stories for the past 65 years, and it's lovely to find they're all coming true now. All the beautiful stories about Archangel.
I remember my wife saying to me when she met someone and they asked about her. She said, "Who is it that you are going out with just now?" And she said, "Oh, I'm going out with Michael Fraser." You see, and this boy said, "You're not going out with the Fraser twins. They have this Russian background, they're daft. They're wild beyond belief."
We used to gather together, you know, on the shores of the river and burn, you know, have a bonfire. And then after we had baked our potatoes, which we usually stole from some other garden. And then after that we would sing. We sang all kinds of songs. We used to sing, "Боже, царя храни, сильный, державный, царствуй на страх врагам, на славу нам." And then again we would sing, "А это был наш последний и решительный бой, теперь нация наша, А вот еще другое, которое, может быть, не особенно. Вот 3 деревни, 2 села, 8 девок на дня. Больше нельзя.
Слышно?
I remember I had been swimming and I came back. It was a beautiful summer's night. We were all sitting on the balcony facing the river and talking peacefully. My young aunt was busy embroidering, I remember, when suddenly we heard the front door bell. And when we went, here was a group of men, and they arrived to take away my grandfather once again. My grandmother got into a great state, of course. She wept. We were all very upset. And he was told that he could take so much with him. So my grandmother and my young aunt were all running around helping. He was very calm. He said, I have done nothing wrong. You must not be so upset. And then he said goodbye to us all. My father, who was ill, he went to see him in his room and said goodbye to him and blessed him. And then he went away. My brother and I ran to the window and we saw him. He was a very tall man, very broad-shouldered, very imposing, very brave. And he walked in the middle of the road with the two men who had arrested him on either side of him, and he was towering above them. And that was the last time I saw my dedushka. I never saw him again. This was a great favorite amongst young girls. I used to do, actually, you can go a tremendous height. It was reaching the stage that the whole way of life was disintegrating. It was difficult to eat. We never knew what we were going to eat that same evening. There were several searches. And in this particular search, I remember we were all put into one room. But my mother, she was going around the house opening presses and wardrobes and was at that particular moment in the garret. Well, in a little while, we heard all the soldiers coming down and they were carrying an enormous basket. Now, in this basket, there used to be held all the flags of our allies, the American, the French, the Belgian and the Italian, and all these, and of course the old imperial flag. We were all a bit frightened because already my grandfather, as I said, was arrested, and my young uncle was likewise in prison. And as each flag was examined by the commissar, who was sitting at the table and writing down something on a bit of paper, the flags were put back in the basket. And then there was one flag spread out, and the commissar was rather puzzled by it. It depicted the lion rampant. And at this point, my mother stepped forward and she said, "This is the flag of Scotland. I am from Scotland. You cannot have it. It is my flag." And there was a dead and rather terrified silence, because, as I said already, some of my relatives were in prison. And we wondered how it would all go. When suddenly the commissar burst out laughing and turned to the soldiers and said, "Here's a wench for you lads." And at that point he said to my mother, "You can keep your flag, take it." And she took it, and I found it many, many years after amongst her belongings. Then we also heard that the house was going to be confiscated. And there was really no future at all, especially for my mother, who was Scottish. And it was then that my parents decided that if we were to survive, that is my brother and I and our mother, we simply had to try and reach Scotland. And that is what eventually happened. We left. My father was very seriously ill. He had multiple sclerosis. He could not have traveled with us. But he always hoped that there might be some change so that we might return. The ship, of course, came from this distance, and it was the last ship, I may tell you. It was October. In another 2 weeks or so, the river would have been frozen. And this was a ship called Sever, meaning the north. And we were allowed to leave on it. And of course, it came from the docks all the way down there. And it came sailing very, very slowly here. And I remember, you know, this is the we faced west, so that all buildings, you know, with the setting sun used to be lit up, of course, with the western setting sun. And I always remember as we were passing, I stood watching and saying to myself, I must always remember this, for I shall never see it again. It passed and vanished. It was there I got a last glimpse. And a funny thing, it disappeared, and then the ship seemed to rise again. And I saw it. And then it vanished forever. Up to 1934, I did receive letters, but after that, I lost all contact. The last letter I got was from my young uncle, Jura, who was almost like an older brother of mine. And in that letter, he talked about many things and reminded us of the happy times we had together. In 1945, I received a letter from Finland explaining to me why I had never received any answers. The reason was quite simple. They were all dead in Archangel. All my relatives were dead in Archangel. My father, what remained of his life, was centered around this deep wish that we would return again, which of course we never did. He never saw us after we left in 1920. My grandparents, my Aunt Marga and her husband who was executed, and Jura, who actually knew he was due for execution, took his own life. My grandparents, I have to say, died through sheer, very hard existence. They died within a fortnight of each other in the year 33.
Благословен Бог наш, всегда ныне и присно веки веков.
In short, there was just no one, except this young boy who was born in 1924 and whom I met after all these years later.
Святый Боже, святый крепкий, святый бессмертный, помилуй нас. Святый Боже, святый крепкий, святый бессмертный, помилуй нас. Раб Твоих.
as I began to write, I was overwhelmed, perhaps by my memories, and a passionate desire to bring back the people I have known the best way I could. You see, so many people perished during the terrible time of the revolution. And so many are gone and people don't even know where they're buried. But I thought here might be a family that would live again.